We're going to let everybody log into the session and we'll get our event started momentarily. Good morning and welcome to WITA. I am Ken Levinson, the Executive Director of WITA, and we're delighted to have you all here today. Before we get to today's event, a few announcements about our upcoming events. Next week, we have two events focused on U.S. trade with the rest of the world. First, on Tuesday, April 13th at 1 p.m., we have a special event discussing U.S., EU, and global trade. We'll have guests at that event coming from Washington, Germany, Brussels, and Lithuania. Then on Wednesday, April 14th at 9:30 a.m., we'll be discussing U.S. trade with Central America, which is in the news these days because of the rise in immigration from the region. That event also ties in nicely with today's discussion about why do we trade and what role trade should play as a tool in our diplomatic arsenal. Information on all these events can be found on our website, www.wita.org. Before I introduce our panel, we'd like to welcome a few members of our audience who you are in community with today, even if you can't see their face on Zoom. So welcome today to Brian Pomper at Aiken Gump, Christine Bliss at CSI, Warren Mariama at Hogan and Lovells, Peter Allgeier at Nauset Global, Barbara Wiesel at Rock Creek Global Advisors, and Bruce Hirsch at Tailwind Global Strategies. I can honestly name a dozen other audience members today who are also well known in US and global trade circles, but I don't have time to read our entire audience list. So welcome today again to Brian, Christine, Warren, Peter, Barbara, and Bruce, and welcome to all of you. As you know, in addition to doing a very deep dive in 2021 on trade and the environment, we're also looking at what worker-centric and inclusive trade might mean for US policy. We started this discussion last month with two events discussing trade and gender. But in a lot of ways, today's event is really the kickoff of the series. Our hope today is that we get into a discussion of first principles, starting with the question, why do we trade? What role should international trade play in our larger economic policy picture? And what purpose does it serve in advancing America's broad international agenda? Of course, this could be a subject for a doctoral dissertation or a year-long course of study, but we only have an hour, and I couldn't be more pleased than to welcome today's expert panel to the discussion. My dear friend, Grant Aldonas, who many of you know from his years of service to our country, Beth Baltzan, who's done groundbreaking work examining the history of American trade policy, Dan Ikenson, a prolific commentator on the benefits of open markets and free trade, Sarah Prey, who's a leading voice on economic justice issues at the Open Society Foundations, and our moderator today, who most of you know by byline, if not by his face, David Lynch, the global economics correspondent for the Washington Post. Thank you all for joining us today. If you're watching this on Zoom, you can ask questions using the Q&A tab on the bottom of your screen. We'll try to get to as many of those questions as we can toward the end of our discussion. David?
Thanks, Ken. Good morning, everyone. Glad you could join us. So after several years of tariffs, trade wars, and tumult, we now have an opportunity to take stock. Much about trade policy changed after Joe Biden left government in 2017. The Trump administration blew up the longstanding bipartisan consensus in favor of reducing trade barriers and replaced it with a more nationalist approach to cross-border commerce. Some of the changes that President Trump introduced, President Biden is likely to jettison. Others he may well keep. But today we're not going to be overly focused on specific policy predictions or accounts of who's up and who's down in the new administration. As Ken suggested, we're going to pull back a bit and consider some fundamentals that are being seriously debated, perhaps for the first time in quite a while. What are the first principles of trade? What's the point of the exercise? Why, in short, do countries trade? We'd like to frame today's discussion in terms of alternative perspectives on the appropriate objectives for trade policy. Are those goals purely economic? Or is trade the policy equivalent of the Swiss Army knife? able to achieve a variety of economic and social goals, greater wealth, progress on climate change, and the promotion of global peace and stability, to name just a few. Fortunately, we have 4 experts with us today who can definitively answer these and all other questions about trade. And since no one ever came to a webinar to hear the moderator talk, we will turn to them. Beth, let's start with you. Give us a little historical context for our discussion today. How have the rationales for trade changed over time? And how distinctive was the post-World War II moment that created the rules-based approach to trade?
Thanks so much, Dave, for the question, and thanks to WITA for including me in this panel, kicking off the Worker-Centric trade policy series, which is terrific. I think trade, the motivation for trade has been different at different moments in history. So if we think about the dawn of civilization, it was pretty basic. One group had stuff, another group had other stuff. They could barter, and both groups were better off. And then it gets more complicated. You get the introduction of money, supply routes, fights over controlling those supply routes, and eventually efforts to monopolize production of and trade in commodities. And by the time we get to the 16th century, you see the emergence of mercantilist thought, where trade isn't about mutual benefit. It's got more of a zero-sum flavor to it. Of course, mercantilists bred anti-mercantilists, and trade folks are very familiar with Adam Smith. I think for purposes of this series, it's really helpful to focus on how much of what motivated Adam Smith was about working people. I think a lot of the discussion ends up exaggerating his views on tariffs, but what really bothered him was tariffs in support of monopolies. And those monopolies were extracting monopoly rents from the working class and depressing their standard of living. And he went on to point out that capital, if it possibly can get away with it, will seek to suppress wages, and that labor is relatively powerless in that relationship, which is a theme that we'll see going forward. So to your comment about what happened after World War II, again, I think there's an oversimplified narrative that it's sort of all about tariffs and mea culpa for Smoot-Hawley. I think it's much richer than that. And if we look at the Atlantic Charter from 1941 that set the stage for the post-war order, we see them talking about territorial integrity, self-determination, non-discriminatory trade, and then economic justice. In the Atlantic Charter, there's a reference to cooperating to lift labor standards, economic advancement, and social security. And all of those are of a piece because they had learned their lessons from the 30s, that economic deprivation, economic injustice paves the way for authoritarianism. And that's what Hitler was able to take advantage of, coupled with discriminatory trade policies, including monopolies and cartels, that helped him build his border stomping fascist war machine. And we see the representation of those views. So what Churchill and Roosevelt wanted to do was establish a post-war order that prevented that kind of thing from happening again. That's what we see in the Havana Charter, which actually has a through line back to Smith with references to disciplining monopolies and protecting workers, an employment chapter that has worker rights in there. And that carried the day for a long time until the end of the Cold War in the 80s. And the separation of economic liberalization and political liberalization, sort of that Francis Fukuyama line of thinking, that those two things could be separated. But in terms of the post-war order, I think we really have to understand that trade was part of this larger piece of actually promoting democracy, particularly in Western Europe, where in 46, 47, it was hanging in the balance. We needed trade, we needed the Truman Doctrine, we needed the Marshall Plan. All of these things were designed to save democracy.
Great. I want to come back later to that relationship or interplay between political and economic liberalization and what the China example tells us about that. But Dan, I wanted to ask you about something that you've said or written, that the sole purpose of trade is to increase the size of the national pie. If the bottom line truly is the decisive consideration, doesn't that suggest that we could end up buying all our bullets and bombs from the low-cost Chinese supplier and and thereby end up terribly vulnerable? Dan, I think you're still muted. There you go.
There, sorry. Thanks for setting it up that way, David. I appreciate that. And Ken, thanks for the invitation to join WITA and the esteemed panelists here. I think the objective of trade policy is to grow the pie. And after that pie is grown, we should then turn to social policy to deal with how the spoils are distributed. I would say the framing of the question today is excellent. I really liked it. It made me think about the purpose of trade policy and that some of these ideas behind why we have trade policy may be working at cross purposes, may be incongruous or incompatible with each other. Is trade an economic tool? Is it a tool of domestic social policy? Or is it a geopolitical tool? So I would distinguish between trade on one hand and trade policy on the other, because they're very different animals. I mean, trade is very much an economic endeavor. Trade policy is very much a political endeavor. And on the economics, we trade so that we can specialize, and we specialize so that we can produce more, and we produce more so that we can consume and save more. And that's how we create wealth and generate higher living standards. If there were no agreement to trade, tacit or explicit agreement, we would not be able to specialize. The game would be over. So let me just provide an example, and where Beth took us back into history, which is a much more compelling place to be than where I'm going to take you, which is the dark depths of Econ 101. Let me just give you a little story. So assume, well, I am an economist. I produce trade and economic analysis, and that's my contribution to GDP. I've never gone hunting. I can garden, but I don't know that I could grow all the food that I need to survive. I can hammer nails, but I don't think I could build a house. And I really have no idea how to make clothing, yet I'm able to consume all of those necessities and other goods and services without having the slightest idea how to produce them. So by specializing on economic analysis, I can take my output, which is monetized in the form of a salary, and I can trade it for food, housing, clothing, and anything else that I don't make but can afford. Again, I would not be able to specialize in economic and policy analysis if I couldn't count on others making and distributing my clothing, food, housing, and everything else that I want to consume. So if I lived in isolation on some island and had to produce just the necessities that I needed to survive, I would spend all of my days devoting portions of my time to each endeavor. I would live hand to mouth. I would be destitute. Life would be, to quote Hobbes, nasty, brutish, and short. And fortunately, in the modern economy, most people can choose not to live that way. And by living in a society where our output is monetized, the rules of domestic trade are tacitly agreed, and we can focus on producing the one good or service we are best at producing, which can collectively produce more than if we each toiled producing everything we need or want to consume without trade. So we are able to specialize and produce more collectively because we've agreed to trade, and the ability to consume more from the same amount of productive effort is the definition of increased wealth and higher living standards. The benefits of trade, very crudely put, are the extra things we can consume or save as a result of trade. So this, in a nutshell, is the economic case for free trade. The benefits of trade are properly measured in terms of the things we get to consume but didn't have to produce. In other words, imports are the benefits of trade, exports are the price of imports. Just like the case when you go to the grocery store and want to get the most items for your dollar, when we trade, we want to get the greatest value of imports for a given unit of exports. And this is the so-called terms of trade. The more efficient you are in producing your output and the more valuable your output, the more imports you can purchase with a given unit of exports, which means the better the terms of trade. This is the case for us as individuals, and it is the case for us as a country. And as Adam Smith, to quote him again, famously observed, what is prudence in the conduct of every private family can scarce be folly in that of a great kingdom. So free trade is the extension of free markets across political borders, and enlarging markets in this manner to integrate more buyers, sellers, investors, and workers enables more refined specialization and economies of scale, which lead to greater wealth and higher living standards. So now let me just turn to trade policy before closing up, which is not an economic endeavor. It's a political endeavor, and it turns the logic of trade on its head. So US trade policy tends to treat the openness of the US economy, low tariffs, low other barriers, as a favor to foreign producers and foreign governments. It's a favor we grant when governments behave in a manner of which we approve. It's a favor which must be balanced against other concerns such as job displacement, national security, geopolitical objectives. Now, national security, foreign policy, domestic jobs, and economic opportunities are obviously all legitimate concerns of policymakers, but the methods of pursuing objectives in those realms, imposing tariffs, suspending GSP benefits, including rigid rules of origin that limit supply chain latitude in trade agreements and prioritize enforcement over liberalization, all raise the costs of imports. They worsen the terms of trade, and they hurt US citizens as consumers, taxpayers, producers, investors, and workers. Sure, the US is still relatively open by some standards. We have low tariffs, open investment regime, but most of our tariff peaks are on clothing, food, and shelter. Tariffs are a regressive tax. They hurt lower income families more than higher income families. They hurt small business more than large business. A common refrain we hear from those trying to justify protectionism is trade policy shouldn't be about access to cheap imports. Presidents Obama and Trump both had some iteration of the following, that who cares if you get cheaper t-shirts if your neighbor's put out of a job as a result of that? Well, here's why. Because it frees up resources to be deployed elsewhere in the economy. Cheaper t-shirts aren't the goal, but the mechanism through which trade benefits are conveyed. It's the extra savings and spending power that can be used to propagate the economy elsewhere around the country. And it's this failure to see beyond the cheaper t-shirt that obscures the case for free trade. Now, it is this asymmetry that explains much of the popular skepticism about trade, I think. I'm not unsympathetic to concerns about job displacement and its social costs, or about national security and foreign policy objectives, but I worry that the politics influences trade policy in ways that deeply discounts the importance of economics and morality. But we must remember that protectionism benefits producers over consumers, favors big business over small, hurts lower income more than higher income consumers, and it deprives the economy of stronger terms of trade that help produce the higher living standards we've enjoyed. That all said, I think trade policy today, by which I mean over the past 20, 25 years, but more sharply in focus during the Trump administration and into the Biden administration, trade policy has very clearly prioritized domestic social policy and national security over economics. And I don't see the USTR doing anything on trade that could be perceived as working at cross purposes against the administration's geopolitical and domestic manufacturing priorities. Trade policy is and will continue to be subordinated to broader priorities of the White House, State, and Treasury departments, I think, for the foreseeable future. So I will stop there and turn it back to you, Dave.
Great. Grant, the rise of global supply chains, value chains, is one of the distinguishing features of the era. What have been some of the adjustment challenges that both communities and individual workers have faced as a consequence, and how well or poorly have they been met?
David, thanks for the question, and thanks to Ken, of course, and WITA. Your question actually dovetails nicely with what both Beth and Dan were saying, but it's useful to go back a step to what causes the development of those supply chains. Ultimately, it's technology that has essentially thinking out of the mainstream economics and actually talking about institutional economics, which has a lot more to do with what drives trade. The race between technology and governments trying to keep up has in effect dropped the transaction costs. So you now can organize your firm on a much more horizontal basis. You don't have to depend on vertical integration. The international rules of the trading system actually contribute to that. But the point is what's driving this change of globalization is driving an awful lot of adjustment in the global economy and in the US economy. That's a process that's been unfolding since the 1970s, and we've done an amazingly poor job of actually addressing adjustment. When you think about, certainly when I was getting out of college and looking for work, high inflation, high unemployment, all these things going on, and nobody really understood what was driving it. The best source I ever found when I was writing a book back in 2009 was a great book by Claudia Golden and Larry Katz of Harvard called The Race Between Technology and Education. And it explained in a microcosm that from a worker's perspective, unless you're equipping them with the tools to participate in the economy, you've missed the ball game in terms of human capital and justice in your own society. And so one of the great failures, certainly in my tenure in government, was to drive us toward a broader adjustment policy, one that actually wasn't trade linked. Because ultimately, when we talk about what we need today, part of what I like about Build Back America, David, is they're actually focused for the first time on putting broadband in schools, nationwide. Those are the sort of steps we need to take. But there's also much more minor things that we could do. A good example is, and people don't think this way, people tend to think about trade policy as the tool we're going to use to solve this problem. But the reality is the tax code tells you to stay in your current job. If you're a candle maker and you think that electric light is a sort of a passing phase, and you say, I'm going to double down and take some courses in candle making, guess what? You can deduct that on your taxes. Now, if you say, I'm really thinking this is the end for candle making, we're going to use electric lights going forward, I should turn to coding, you can't deduct that on your taxes. You can't even amortize it, even though it truly is a capital investment. In other words, the tax code is telling people to stay in their jobs and where they are rather than encouraging their mobility as we're in this race between education and technology. And there's a series of things like that. And I can point out others in the tax code, but we're stuck with a policy called Trade Adjustment Assistance Policy, which gives money to workers, mediated mostly through unions, which do a great job of sort of organizing the flow, but that leaves out most workers in today's economy. Secondly, trade adjustment to firms, which I oversaw when I was at the Commerce Department, David, was the strangest thing I've ever seen. It basically had led to the creation of an entire industry of government contractors that were responsible for doling out the funds. And I had yet to see a firm that actually benefited from the adjustment funds, right? So we've got this rather crabbed, limited policy that's connected to trade when the changes we're seeing in the economy are far more far-reaching. And in some respects, I'd like to see a technology-centric worker policy as much as a worker-centric policy on technology as much as a worker-centric policy on trade at this point, because it's a much bigger dynamic that we have to grapple with that's driving those global supply chains that are shifting resources. And we have a system that is essentially discouraging mobility.
Great, interesting stuff. Thanks, Sarah. We've focused a lot on objectives, but of course, process matters too. Can often determine the outcome. So, what do we need to change in the way that we negotiate trade agreements in order to get better outcomes, to get more inclusive outcomes?
Thanks, Dave, and thanks so much to WITA for having me here, especially among this panel. I am not a trade expert. I work on economic justice more broadly, and trade is, of course, an important piece of that. But what that means for this conversation when thinking about economic justice is looking at the impacts and beneficiaries of global trade. And as David rightly said, the first thing to address in determining who benefits and how we can get more people to benefit is to look at whose interests are represented during the trade pipeline from negotiation of trade agreements to the resolution of disputes arising from these trade agreements. And, I appreciate Dan's point about sort of growing the pie. I want to get into that question of whose slices are how big. And I think the way that we have to start that conversation is just asking who is at the table talking about the pie, and how we grow it and what we're going to do with it and whose interests are being represented. So there are 3 points I wanted to make. The first is really on this question of democratic negotiation and participation in the process. So we at the Open Society Foundations have been trying to bring more democracy back into the picture when it comes to the negotiation of trade agreements. And you know, that doesn't mean that your average person needs to be sitting in the negotiating rounds of, you know, different trade agreements, because that is unrealistic. And also, you know, I shudder to think what those agreements would look like if we just sort of had them, you know, via Wikipedia, you know. But there is something to be said for representation and the asymmetry of power between the different negotiating interests that happen, not just, you know, US and the rest of the world, but also even within the United States. And, you know, the USTR has trade advisory committees that obviously are an incredibly important tool for gathering the impact, feedback, and opinions related to trade policy of lots of different constituencies. But, you know, Grant just pointed out something really important, that you can't just look to the unions in order to represent all of workers. You can't just look to one industry to represent all of industry. So I think we need to go back to the drawing board to look at what the composition of those looks like right now and how it is manifesting in terms of the impacts that we want to see. Do we have the right people in those and the right interests? And I think you have to look at both sort of the participation and the impact in order to sort of reconcile the two. I mentioned sort of the US interest versus, you know, the rest of the world. I'm a big believer in institutions, and I think that trade policy, and I really like Dan's distinction between trade and trade policy. I think trade policy is a great way to set standards and rules that mean that American companies are not competitively disadvantaged when they want to do the right thing, you know, pay living wages, ensure supply chains that adhere to best practices. So, you know, I see trade policy as a great avenue in order to raise those standards and ensure that there is more of an equal playing field for US and other actors. And I think it goes to something else that Dan was saying, that, you know, why are we really engaging in some of these? And I think let's conduct that analysis from day one of, if this isn't an economic impact. I mean, we knew TPP wasn't about economic impact. You saw the ITC report that showed an incredibly modest potential economic benefit. So if it was about something else, if it was about national security or China, then can we ensure that the things that we are agreeing to are worth that cost? And I think Dan and I would probably disagree on the things that we are okay agreeing to. I mean, for the Open Society Foundations, one of our real stumbling blocks has always been around intellectual property and what that means for access to medicines. And obviously with the COVID pandemic, we're thinking about these issues even more. I am concerned that we give away too much in order to achieve gains, or, you know, potential gains that aren't economic related, but we're not as upfront as I wish we would. So that really goes to transparency. So I talked about democracy and participation and representation, getting the right people at the table. Let's get things more out in the public. I mean, the fact that we don't have more working drafts that are publicly distributed for comment and consumption, I think, is a missed opportunity. The last thing that I want to mention is that if we're going to have a worker-centric trade policy, I see the investor-state dispute settlement mechanism as being incompatible with that. I think dispute resolution is obviously important, but to have a sort of one-way street, a mechanism that investors can access judicial remedy that often can favor their interest over the public's, for me is a major issue. And obviously we've seen some movement on that recently, where people are realizing that either we need alternatives to ISDS or perhaps abandoning it altogether. Again, not saying that we don't need dispute resolution. Of course we do. Otherwise we wouldn't have enforceability of these trade agreements, which is important. But this idea of sort of prioritizing investor interest over the public's, I think is a major stumbling block in ensuring truly inclusive trade. So I hope one thing that we can talk about today is also, you know, if we're talking about worker-centric and inclusive trade, we need to break this down among the different communities and how it impacts them. So in the United States, that means Black and brown communities, that means women. I know we'd already had a panel on gender and trade. And then in the global South, I think it means this idea of sort of the more developed nations and developing. So I would love, in that sort of impact analysis that we're talking about of, why we're entering into this agreement and what we hope to achieve from it, we ensure that that is at the center of it, that we are not further disadvantaging Black and brown communities in the US or poorer communities in other countries in order to achieve those aims.
Great.
Thanks so much.
Thanks very much, Sarah. I'd like to drill down a little bit more on this idea of the worker-centric trade policy, because the Biden administration has obviously used that label to distinguish themselves from their predecessors. But certainly President Trump talked a lot about blue-collar workers, and I think Ambassador Lighthizer would say that they were certainly trying to make things better for American workers with the rules of origin and the USMCA and doing away with the ISDS setup that Sarah objects to. So I'm wondering just how much overlap is there in the objectives between the two administrations, and what you folks see as perhaps the sharpest difference. And I'll throw that open to anybody, but maybe Grant or Dan, you'd like to take the first whack.
Well, if I could start, David, I spent 4 years rereading George Orwell, and I am shocked to find that it's still relevant. I mean, at the end of the day, my favorite quote of Orwell's comes from a really obscure review he did of a Bertrand Russell book, David, but it was a famous quote, which is, "We've sunk to such depths that the first obligation, first duty of intelligent men and women is to restate the obvious." And I think with worker-centric, we could use a little of that. Because if you think about the virtues Dan was talking about, and then you try and translate that into trade policy, you would say, I need a trade policy that preserves the virtues that Dan properly outlined economically. It's not just the division of labor, it's the fact that we're eliminating the most regressive burdens in our taxes, those being tariffs, as well as in other restraints. And to Sarah's point, I take a pilgrimage every year to the Walmart in Winchester, Virginia on Labor Day, because I see women from the hill country coming and buying shoes and clothing. And as Dan pointed out, I know they don't, that they're paying twice as much as they should as a result of our tariff policy. You can see the sort of moral quotient of what would a worker-centric trade policy mean in a context for those workers. And if you tick through the sort of obvious elements, yeah, you would want to reduce our barriers to trade in textiles, food, and clothing that drive up the cost of living for people on a modest income. You would certainly want to persuade other countries to do the same, not only in their own interest, but because it allows our workers to reap the benefits of their productivity by selling goods internationally. A third element would certainly involve trade agreements that reflect basic insights of gravity models. We ought to go where the biggest buck is. That implies Canada and Mexico, interestingly enough. Fourth element would be discouraging other countries from acting as free riders or otherwise undermining the trading system. Here I'm pointing at China. And then the final element is involving openness toward economic integration with countries that share our values. And that's both with respect to how we organize the economy and with respect to the human dignity that is driven by our fundamental documents. Well, if you look at that, you end up with a trade policy that looks very much like what Beth began to describe that came out of the GATT and the WTO system. So then the question is, what does worker-centric mean from the point of view of the administration? That's unclear, but I doubt that they intended to pick up where President Obama left off in negotiating the TPP and just continue that policy. So that's where I come back to Orwell. I want to hear a clear definition from the administration of what worker-centric means, because worker-centric to me means that you're trying to liberalize trade and you're using other elements of policy like tax, social policy, technology policy, certainly investments in infrastructure, to ensure that the benefits of globalization and trade are cascading through the economy and raising standards of living even when wages aren't rising. So I need to know more in some respects, because I can articulate what I think would preserve the virtues Dan talked about and pick up some of the justice issues that Sarah talked about. But I don't know that that's the definition the administration is talking about.
Yeah, great.
David, if I may
Sure.
get involved here. The cynic in me would say it's not worker-centric policy that the administration wants, but the swing state worker-centric policy that it wants. But I am trying my hardest not to be a cynic anymore and looking at this more objectively. And I would say that the way this was framed, the questions were asked for this event. It says, what is the national interest in trade? Is it economic growth, national international stability, upward mobility for workers, and which workers? I think all three of those are legitimate objectives of US policy. The problem is that the way the manifestation of our pursuit of those policies now works at cross purposes. And we need to figure out a way to be able to have demonstrably pro-growth trade policies that are also not subverting workers and worker mobility, but in fact, giving them more opportunities. And, Grant spoke of trade adjustment assistance and its continuous failures over the years since 1962. That doesn't really work. And maybe we should be looking at a worker-centric trade and technology policy, as Grant spoke about before. We're on the verge of tinkering with the tax code, with breaking through spending limits that we've never seen. Why not flirt with ideas to incent manufacturers, service providers to train workers in the next generation of technology that they're going to need, rather than to rely on trade adjustment assistance? Have it done at the firm level, and in exchange for these trained workers working for a year or 2 years or something for the company, provide some sorts of tax credits. I think if we are willing to open up, to explore, go where we haven't gone before with policy, and if we're going to be spending all of this money to get there, I think we can get much more creative with how we provide opportunities for people without disincentivizing them from, wanting to work and working hard. And I would also say I agree with Sarah about ISDS. I think that's a real problem, and it's one of the areas that people have found strange that I've written against over the years. But it's just it's a market intervention. It's socializing risk that should be borne by U.S. businesses on other U.S. entities, and it's unfair. So I'll stop at that.
Right. Beth, I wanted to get back to the issue of the relationship between political liberalization and economic liberalization that somebody mentioned earlier. It used to be sort of a commonplace assumption that political freedom would follow market openings eventually, and there was some evidence from East Asia that suggested that was the case. In China, we saw some initial moves in that direction, but certainly in the last 7, 8, 9 years under Xi Jinping, that's turned around. What broader conclusions, if any, do you take from that? Is it foolish to think that by opening markets we may be paving the way for greater political freedom? Were our hopes of that exaggerated to begin with? How would you assess things?
Yeah, I think Fukuyama in '89 with End of History sort of set the table for that line of thinking. And there's a quote from that article that he basically says there will be no room for China to backslide. There's a great interview he had in a New Statesman maybe in 2018 where he says he was wrong, actually. And what he outlines actually looks very, very progressive. I think it's worth actually going and reading it, because he was sort of the ultimate neoliberal in the 80s. And we're seeing this surge in authoritarianism, even in places where we had trade agreements and we saw this economic liberalization. I think that's what's changing. I think that is a component that people trusted would work and didn't. And I think that's why it's so interesting to go back and revisit what the geniuses who set up the post-war order were trying to achieve, because that's not what it was for them. They didn't think that you could just economically liberalize, certainly not under laissez-faire rules. And I don't think we talk enough about the rules. There's all this talk about free trade. What kind of free trade and what kind of rules do you have? It was very clear to them that you needed rules to protect competition itself, because competition and democracy, there's a quote from Will Clayton in 48 where he says it very clearly: democracy and competition are completely related to each other. And even Smith said way back, in 1775 or whatever it was, you have to be careful when you liberalize trade so that free trade doesn't end up creating the monopolies we're trying to get rid of. So I think it's worth going back and looking, since these were the geniuses who created the system we have so much reverence for. We need to go back and look at what they really thought and not what over time the varnish narrative has been.
David, if I could just interject,
Yeah.
I like the way Beth framed it. I just needed to add a footnote that, having been the chief trade counsel from the majority in 2000, when we passed the permanent normal trade relations for China, I can guarantee you none of the senators had ever read Francis Fukuyama. It was one of those things where as we went through the consideration, I find it fascinating, and this, David, goes to your point, that there's been a rewriting of history as if there was more to this idea that we somehow assumed that democratization would proceed in lockstep with liberalization. Now, the truth is, economic freedom and political freedom are not truly divisible. There is a degree of freedom that you generate when you open up China's economy, when they chose to open up their own economy. But the reality is since I started going to China in 1983, I've seen 3 or 4 Chinas. There was a China that was just starting out, where everybody was still riding bicycles and wearing mask suits. Then there was this movement to start abroad and open the economy with Zhu Rongji. Then when I was at the Commerce Department, we had that generation that had survived the Cultural Revolution by keeping their heads down. And it was abundantly clear when you were negotiating with them that these were not people like Zhu Rongji who were going to make big changes. It was going to have to be incremental given their politics. Now we have the princeling generation. This is the rebirth of Maoism. The odd thing is that President Xi is actually a pale comparison to the guy who was my counterpart, Guo Xilai, who threw people off of roofs in the middle of the Cultural Revolution. That's who we're dealing with at this point. So in one sense, we shouldn't be surprised that China has changed. It's not so much that we got it wrong at the time, because again, we weren't thinking that democratization would naturally follow. Maybe Frank was, but Frank has always been in outer space with Leo Strauss. The point is to say that we were doing something very practical to move China into the trading system and bind it with the rules such as we could negotiate and were willing to agree with ourselves at that time. Now, times have changed, and now we should adjust in terms of our outlook and our strategy and tactics. And I say that both with respect to what we should be doing in terms of trade policy with China, but also what we should be doing with respect to human rights. And I really welcome the fact that human rights is back on the agenda with the Biden administration, because that pressure needs to be there as well. I think that goes to the point Sarah raised earlier, that what we do internationally in defense of our values and in trying to expand those values can be an element of trade policy, but it's a much broader front in which we need to be moving. I think the president's there.
Right. And how about the notion of how our pursuit of our objectives will be policed? Is the notion of a multilateral organization, a single body, the WTO, adjudicating trade disputes, is that still the way to go in the future, despite the rise of successful state capitalism in places like China? Or are we inevitably moving back into some sort of bifurcated world economy with rival camps and systems as we saw in the Cold War. And that's for whoever wants to take a crack at it.
Given that my first job back in the State Department as a Foreign Service officer was as a defense economist in the Office of East-West Trade, where all we were doing was imposing sanctions at that point, David. I mean, you really did have two separate worlds. We're never going to go that way with China. China actually has made the choice to integrate itself into the global economy. The terms of that integration are becoming very clear, and the costs of it to American workers as well as American enterprise is becoming clear. That, to me, does imply a bifurcated system. If we're going to depend on a rule in the WTO for complete consensus to move anything, even an agreement on trade and the environment that is desperately needed, that is not sufficient. So you take climate change. China is likely to always be an outlier, but Bill Nordhaus put together a good article in Foreign Affairs about a climate club. Well, what would that be? That essentially would be a trade arrangement about how we would deal with carbon reduction and the potential that somebody could subsidize their way and undermine the system. And we need to avoid that kind of free riding. Well, that's going to have to be outside the WTO, and it's going to go back to a series of countries that actually share the aim of trying to achieve that. And that's likely on the agenda between Kerry and Timmerman in Brussels. But the important point is to know that we can't stand still. The WTO rules are helpful as a baseline, but we need to keep moving because the world keeps changing around us. And China is a good example of that as far as I'm concerned.
Great.
Can
Sarah,
I just add really quick 2 fingers on that? What I would hate for us to do is to approach the question of the WTO only through the lens of talking about China. Because what I worry then is that we're going to end up creating 90 enemies that we don't need to, right? So my plea would be, obviously China and our relationship with them, trade and otherwise, has to be a huge motivating factor here. But I'm even concerned a little bit with some of the Biden administration's plans that I think take for granted a lot of support from other allies without shoring up that support. And I think the WTO would be an easy way for us to lose the support of a lot of our allies by sort of coming at it myopically, just trying to address the China factor without the bigger picture.
Sarah's right.
So before we go to audience questions to wrap up our hour, I'm going to ask all of you one question. You can take this as seriously or not seriously as you'd like. But if you had a magic wand or were named trade czar or czarina for the day and could change one thing about the way the American public understands the trade debate or the way that trade is being conducted globally or anything at all under this rubric, what one thing would you change? And Beth, since I started with you at the outset, I'll come to you again at the end.
I actually think the terms free trade and protectionism are almost meaningless in today's era. So I would like to see us move in a direction where we talk about these issues in a more nuanced way that reflects reality. I think that oversimplifies the conversation. And then you see the polls. People support free trade. People don't support free trade. Well, the poll, whenever you really get into the polls, it depends on the nature of the questions and the nature of the rules. So I think we can all have a better discussion if we move away from those polls.
Right. Others?
Sure. There are pervasive myths, I think, that have prevented Americans from ascertaining how trade's benefits are manifest. And we see this, every 2 years when there's a new Congress and the same questions are asked about trade. There's a failure to grasp sort of rudimentary concepts. I know that sounds very condescending, but what I mean to say is most people think trade is a competition between Team America and Team China or Team Europe or Team Canada. It's not. Trade is not a competition between countries. It's a cooperative endeavor. We scratch each other's back by engaging in trade. The trade deficit does not mean that we are losing at trade or that we're being cheated. That needs to be corrected, particularly if you're the country that issues the world's most prominent reserve currency. Trade deficits are really not that significant. The US manufacturing sector, although it employs fewer people than it did in 1979 when it peaked out at about 19.4 million, still produces enormous amounts of value. On a per capita basis, much more than we did in 1953 when manufacturing was the driver of the US economy. Now it's much less significant to the economy. So we're producing much more output, but with fewer workers. So that's a different sort of problem. It's not manufacturing. And finally, I'd say outsourcing is nothing to revile. Outsourcing is the equivalent of consumers going to the store and selecting and choosing between their options. Businesses need to be able to do that in order to compete in the economy. Outsourcing is not always a matter of shutting down a factory in Ohio and then reconstructing it rafter by rafter, bolt by bolt in Mexico to produce to export back to the United States. Outsourcing is much more complementary to domestic production than it is a substitute for. And so those myths are pervasive and persistent, and I think they're holding us back on using trade policy to advance the interests of Americans across the spectrum.
Dan,
Right.
can I just say, I almost entirely agree with you, and I'm wondering if we've gone into some type of vortex of space and time where, but I totally agree. And I would just love my one finger interjection here is that I would love if I could wave a wand is to take the fear-based approach to trade out of this. That so much of not just the sort of impetus behind some of the policy making, but the messaging and frankly the sort of constituent demand is fear-based. As sort of Dan was mentioning, it's the zero-sum game that Beth also mentioned. That would be my wand, is that let's talk about the pie and who gets it, and don't be afraid, you're still going to get a good slice. Okay.
Right.
David, I'm going back to George Orwell. Honestly, the most important thing is to restate the obvious and be honest about it. What we've suffered from in the trade debate for really almost the entire 40 years I was in Washington is lies. And there's nothing worse than that malleable term national security, as we saw during the Trump administration. Anything can be abused. Washington, as we all know, is filled with clever people, but not people who are particularly wise. And wisdom really flows from being honest and transparent, as Sarah was saying earlier. I mean, I kind of laugh because I used to be fairly good friends with Senator Moynihan, and Moynihan used to say about the entire system of classifying documents in the United States, that there should be top secret, secret, confidential, and then just too damn embarrassing to let anyone know, right? Because most of the stuff that's hidden is just the embarrassing crap. And we suffer throughout this whole debate from a level of dishonesty that has now come and brought us to this point where we think all sorts of things, myths that Dan was describing on all sides of the argument. And I think Joe Biden is a guy who, at least in my experience with him when he was on the Hill, and I was on the Hill, is that he's an honest guy. He's the perfect guy, actually, to take us in this direction. I just hope he fills in loopy terms like worker-centric with some meaning that would actually give all of us some confidence that he's being honest with the American people about what's going on. Right? That's what I really think is missing.
Right. Thanks. Ken?
Thank you. You guys have had, it's such a terrific conversation. I personally, when we envisioned this event, I couldn't have asked for more. We've had a few questions come in. I'm going to try to tie some of them together. This one I'm going to direct your way a little, Sarah. It's about the pie. Is the answer, is the transparency issue, and the transparency issue as well, Grant, you were talking about the secret documents and the embarrassing documents. Even the trade materials, to ask, are not readily accessible. The Federal Register is not an easy thing to navigate. not accessible to that many people without a baseline understanding. No one's reading the harmonized tariff schedule on their own. It's completely useless. Which gets us to a question that came in to Dan about tariffs on clothing. But the question, Sarah, a little bit is, is getting people to the table when we're baking the pie, when we're putting the ingredients for the pie together, a key part of making sure that it's equitably distributed later? Because instead what we've been doing is the pie's already baked, and then we're trying to decide who gets it. Any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. And I couldn't agree more. As I mentioned, I think all at different steps along the trade pipeline, there are going to be moments. I also think, though, Ken, you bring up an important point, which is we're going to have to talk about representation of those interests, because it isn't easily accessible to most people. So I think that's where Dave's last question was actually relevant, because part of the problem is because most people, I think, feel excluded from the system, feel like it's too technical, or it's, too scary or intimidating, or they have such a rudimentary understanding of it that they start from a place of, no, I don't want that. Then that means it's harder for our policymakers to represent those interests, right? So I think we also have to break down all the myths that we were just talking about. And there is absolutely going to be a role here for in the United States, our members of Congress, for getting out better information earlier on. They don't even necessarily have access to the right information either. So I think it's about first making it more accessible, even at the conceptual level, to people, so that our policymakers can better represent those interests, because it isn't going to be direct representation. Absolutely not. But yes, thank you.
Dan, just pivot, this question too about, it just kind of tying it in, do we think that if, by the way, for the record, if I'm on the desert island with you, even though you're an economist, and that means you have three hands, I guess, right? Or the economist needs a third hand. I'm not sure you're the guy I want with. I can't really count on economic analysis to get me through, although maybe you'd be able to distribute the fruits of our labors, or to distribute us equitably the way we do our labor. But regardless, if we're cutting tariffs, is that a be all and end all? Is that, is that benefit going to accrue to the people that need it, or the companies that are benefiting from it, the ones who are going to take the benefit from that? You're muted again, Dan.
It's unmuted and muted myself. Sorry about that. I would say this, Ken. I have the best taste in music, though. So if you were on that island with me, at least we would be enjoying that.
Grant's pretty good at that too.
Look, I hear this argument a lot. If the tariffs, we have tariff peaks on clothing. If we remove those tariffs, reduce them significantly, who would secure the rents? Wouldn't it be the retailers or the distributors or somebody else in the supply chain, and not the consumer? I don't think that's an argument against reducing those tariffs anyway, because I think that it's not the case. I think those rents would be shared and dispersed. If we really want to get to fairness among people who work in particular industries, if you look at the goods that we consume, something like 60% of the goods we consumed in 2017, the last year before the trade war kicked in, were imported, and only 9% of the services that we consumed were imported. Yet we consume far more services than goods. So I think if I were to head up an initiative to create more trade liberalization and have it spread across the economy more broadly, I would focus on services. White collar workers in Washington and on the coasts need to be exposed to competition from abroad. University professors, health officials, health professionals need to be subjected to competition. That benefit would accrue to people in the forms of expanding their spending power. They would have more buying power. And so to me, that's one of the reasons we've had this debate, why this debate has been sort of blue collar against white collar. It's because there hasn't been any trade liberalization in the services region. So maybe the problem is not that people are being left behind in a sense because not all of us have been subjected to the same forces of competition, and we should be.
So let me, I want to take two things, and we're going to have to wrap up. And I appreciate if you guys could just bear with us an extra 5 minutes or so to put a good cap on this. We have a series of questions that came in kind of asking about equity, not just within the United States, but also about the impact of our policies and how we engage with the rest of the world. I think you could say that the same way that there are people in populations in the US who don't feel included in our trade policy, there are countries and regions of the world that don't feel included. And their reaction, Sarah, is sometimes just to say no, because they're not at the table or they don't feel like their interests are being represented. So is there a way that a worker-centric policy can also take into account the workers of other countries in our formulation of trade policy? And should that be something that we're structurally building in as well?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and I think that's one of the reasons why I mentioned the importance of, not focusing too much on China and the WTO, but thinking about the WTO as a whole. I know there's, I've worked with an organization called South Center, which some of you might know, which is developing country governments. And they come together to talk about multiple issues, but trade is one of them. And they have felt this asymmetry of power and, if you want to call it kind of the centering of US interests. And that can be very alienating. And I think I agree that it doesn't have to be zero sum, right? So what I would love to see is an approach that that sort of tries to tackle that asymmetry head on. And maybe just a tiny footnote on that is relevant for the Biden administration to also make sure that when we're looking at our trade policy, and I hope they're doing this, but that the domestic econ folks and the foreign policy econ folks are in cahoots, and that, we're not sort of bifurcating our approach or, sort of pitting one against each other, because I think sometimes that happens, or they happen in isolation. So I totally agree. Yeah.
I could jump in on that.
Yep, please go ahead.
Oh, sorry. And this gets back to a little bit of the discussion about textiles, but we haven't really wrapped our arms around the fact that the way the global trading system works, capital is extremely mobile. We have no baseline rules on labor, on the environment, on tax at the WTO. So capital is in a position to arbitrage all those things down. At what cost to others are the cheap shoes that you buy at Walmart? And if you look at what's going on in Bangladesh, fires, collapsing buildings, look at forced labor in Xinjiang. There really is a cross-border economic justice component to this that we can and should embrace. This is exactly what we did with the Havana Charter. There were just certain thresholds below which you should not go. So I think these all can be, getting away from the zero-sum idea. It just means we have to have a base level of standards so that we stop this race to the bottom. And I think if all we focus on is reducing tariffs in the absence of trying to have these baseline rules, what you'll see is what was revealed by the pandemic, that there are these anti-competitive, distortive factors in the economy that lead to supply chain concentration and make us all vulnerable, including on things like PPE and other textile products.
Ken, I just add a little warning, which is through all this, we have to be very conscious in trade policy as well as elsewhere that there's no equality of opportunity in our own country or globally in the absence of opportunity. We need economic growth. Otherwise, all politics becomes zero-sum, and zero-sum politics reinforces the powers as they exist. They don't actually benefit the weakest in our society and elsewhere. So as we're thinking about this, we actually do need something that translates into a policy with respect to developing countries that is trade liberalizing and it also is working on the institutions of government. Now, Japan actually has a very interesting model, which I wish we would adopt. With Vietnam, they not only negotiated a free trade agreement, they negotiated an arrangement where they provided financial assistance, but it was tied to helping institutions like the Customs Service in Vietnam that actually created certainty in terms of transactions that benefited the people of Vietnam as well as the Japanese exporter. It doesn't take that much for us to pick up the examples that Beth was citing from the past, the examples we see around us, and actually achieve a much more virtuous trade policy. And that to me includes dealing with things like Xinjiang, sorry. I mean, we can't put ourselves in the position where trade becomes an end all and be all in the absence of thinking about the rest of our values. But I will say that growth matters most, because that's what allows us in some respects to bring that opportunity to the poorest in our own society and the poorest around the world. And trade is a very powerful way of doing that.
Well, thank you all. I did have another question. There was a question that came in about the dignity of work, and should that be a focus of what we do, even if it might mean, for example, Dan, that goods cost a little bit more. Is that worth making a priority? You take a stab at it if you want, or we could wrap up. It's sort of a fundamental question, I think, for the worker-centric trade policy to ask that question, is putting those jobs and putting the jobs of American workers, is there more to, is there an unseen benefit to work beyond just economic production, to the dignity of work?
Well, I'm not sure how qualified I am to speak in depth about this, but yes, definitely. People get all sorts of benefits from feeling, get all sorts of benefits from their jobs, and that is, being dislocated from a job can be quite traumatic. And so these are things that we'd like to try to minimize. But if we're asking people to accept higher prices to prevent the job churn, that may be asking too much. I mean, I can see this as part of a corporate social responsibility sort of push, where, hey, this product was made by a factory or a company that pays 25% above market wages. And we think that adds to the dignity of the workers, and it puts them in a better position. You're buying that. That's part of the brand that you're buying. And you as a consumer are happy to do that. But I don't think we should be forcing that upon everybody, especially not lower income consumers in the United States.
And I gotta say, I agree with all that, but I think Ken's question, or the question that was raised, actually goes to something deeper. Knowingly or unknowingly, it reflects something that goes back to Marx. Marx talked about the alienation of a worker from their true self. And in some respects, he talked about the dignity of work. My problem is that I never met a worker, except for a robot, that didn't have a stomach. So I want to be thinking about them as a consumer and a worker at the same time. And we tend to have this debate about workers on the one hand as if they had no stomachs, and consumers on the other hand as if they did no work. And I think this goes back to one of the myths that we have to counteract. Marx wasn't wrong in thinking about the dignity of work and alienation, but the last thing you want to be is alienated from your stomach. And we ought to be able to think about both those ideas at the same time, what works economically as well as what contributes to the dignity of work, and what also gives you a sense of moral worth because of what you're purchasing, right? I want to know from a company where they source their goods. I just think that's honest and transparent. And if we have to have some requirements like that, that's fine.
Yeah, I just want to pull out one tension, which is, I'm not sure if this was what was intended with the question, dignity of work being the job that people want to have, because I think we've seen one of the failures with, I think, trade adjustment assistance actually was that they were often trying to take people from jobs that they wanted to keep and move them into a field they didn't want to do, right? So technology, right? Taking somebody who had worked in a non-tech job and saying, no, all of a sudden, this is what you're going to do. That didn't work. But it also doesn't work to say you get to keep your old job, because those jobs probably don't exist. So what I want to layer in with this dignity is, frankly, feasibility and practicality. But absolutely, I mean, I think that we have seen consumers are willing to pay a premium for fair wages, et cetera. I would actually separate that out from dignity, because I think that's such the lowest bar, that paying, living wages and ensuring clean supply chains, et cetera, that is separate to me than dignity, because dignity is, I don't know, it's a little bit more nuanced.
We love nuance here at WITA. I am incredibly grateful to all of you. Any closing words? David?
No, I think we've already run past time, so I'll echo your thanks for the panelists, who I think did a great job, and it was fun to listen to.
Really, really grateful to all of you. Thank you so much. We are planning several more events to discuss what a worker-centric and inclusive trade policy might mean. As you saw, as I've said at the outset of this, it could be a dissertation topic or a full-length course. We are going to try to do a lot more on this, spend a lot more time digging in. I'm really grateful to all of our speakers, our moderator, David Lynch. Thank you very much. Love this conversation. Thank you all. Please take care of yourself. We'll be calling all of you back. I promise. Everyone out there, take care of yourself. Be safe. Get the shot when you're available to do so. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ken. Appreciate it.